cars, all the fast women, and all the manure I want to deal with. Okay,
Very good.
uh,
Here we go. And
let's go ahead and start. I don't think I have to introduce myself, but I'm a lawyer who's worked in this area for some time. I'm going to give you a real, high-level overview here. The system's very complex, but I'm hoping that we'll be able to do this. Lori, I sent you some permits. Is there any way you're going to be able to show those on your screen when we get to them?
yeah, I'll just close the PowerPoint and bring up the permits.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to go through the permitting system really briefly. I want to say this is very important. This is where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, in the Clean Water Act. And whenever I look at a statute, the first thing I want to know is, how is this enforced? What actually happens here? It's great to pass resolutions that there should be peace on earth, but if there's nothing in the law that's actually going to bring peace on earth, you haven't accomplished much. And the permitting system and enforcement of the permits is where we actually try and reduce pollution. Why don't you go to the next slide here? Okay, so the first thing to know about the Clean Water Act, and this is probably the most important distinction in the whole law, is it distinguishes between point sources and non-point. The point sources are, what you look at and you see a big ugly factory with a pipe coming out of it, and it's your classic situation, but there's also all sorts of other types of point sources. Point sources need NPDES permits, or National Discharge Elimination System permits, pollutant discharge elimination system permits. And the idea, the reason the first thing is why elimination. And the idea of Congress when they passed this law, which was actually an amendment to the 1948 Federal Water Pollution Control Act, was that they were going to eliminate discharges. That's where the elimination comes in this. Of course, spoiler alert, discharges weren't eliminated in 1985. And so we're still granting permits, whatever it is, 40 years after they were supposed to be gone. But let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the bad news is that there are a lot of things that cause very serious pollution that are not covered by the NPDES permit. I'm not going to dwell on this, but basically, row crop agriculture is exempt. Animal agriculture is not exempt, though it's sort of exempt, and I'll perhaps explain that later. But that's the loophole that CAFOs get into. The discharge is really a term of art. So whenever I hear somebody say it was a pollution discharge, I got to know whether they actually know what they're talking about, because a discharge is something that's regulated by the Clean Water Act. If it's non-point, it's not a discharge. The Clean Water Act doesn't really do anything about non-point, except it grants, a few $100 million a year for states to develop non-point controls. I know that sounds like a lot of money to some of you, but in comparison to the scope of the problem, $500 or $600 million is just not dough. I assume all these sounds going off is people who've already gotten bored and are leaving, but I'm going to continue anyway. So we'll go to the next slide. Oh, I've got a question here. Is it a 401 or a 402 permit? It's a 402 permit. 401 is a totally different thing. if you decide you haven't heard enough of me, I can go into 401 sometime, but 401 has to do with state certification of federally issued permits. 402 is the National Pollutant Discharge System. So
You can see Albert anytime in Chicago. Where do you have your stand up?
I'm sorry, I only really do it on Sierra Club and some other lines. You could go to the River Rally next week. So I'm just trying to list, these are all sorts of operations that do need permits and are major pollution sources. The classic is a factory, like I said, but then a huge number of the permits are for publicly owned treatment works. I've spent a lot of my career arguing with managers of POTWs, they're called in the business, but they're not really the bad guys. I mean, they're taking all of what happens when you flush your toilet and they're dealing with it. So they didn't get into the business because they love pollution, but they're under pressure to only control it as much as is cheap. And that's where we get into issues. Another major problem is combined sewer overflows. Those also require a NPDES permit, but they tend to be very complicated permits that require a whole lot of what we call best management practices and monitoring and ways to try and keep the combined sewers from overflowing. Urban stormwater, this is another thing. If you have a separate system, it's going to rain on the parking lots and roofs of places. That's going to go in your creek and it's going to pollute them. And so we try to avoid that. And then finally, concentrated animal feeding operations. Those are also covered by the NPDES permit in theory. If the pollution comes directly from the CAFO, then it is covered. If you take the manure and put it in a truck and then ride it down the road a bit and spray it on a spray field, that is no longer considered a discharge. That is now a non-point if it runs off the field. It's not quite that simple. I'm dealing with it at a very broad level here, but that is the exemption, so to speak, which is the spray field exemption. The theory of it was that, of course, that we've used manure in agriculture for thousands of years as human beings. So surely it's okay to keep doing that. Well, it might be if you used it at the same levels that farmers did 3,000 years ago, but that's not what happens when you take the waste from 10,000 hogs. Next slide. Okay, I'm seeing a question here. What if they say they discharge? I'm not doing very well at handling all these questions. What if they say that discharge has, could somebody read that question for me?
Tertiary treatment.
What if they
Misspelled
say
it.
that, what if they say the manure has gone through tertiary treatment?
Right, yeah.
It doesn't. They're lying. Nobody does that.
Okay.
That would mean that you were essentially sending the waste to a sewage treatment plant like we have for human beings. I mean, there's no reason you couldn't do that, but if you did that, you wouldn't stay in the hog business very long because you wouldn't make much money. I mean, these operations can only operate because they are throwing huge amounts of, untreated manure on fields that's then washing into your water supply. I mean, it's, what if I'm a mafia hitman and I say I don't shoot anybody? I mean, okay.
Well,
All
what if
right.
they're building a state-of-the-art facility and they're going to be treating this stuff before it is being disposed of? Is there a way that you can go in and make sure of that, or is it?
Well, I simply, they would have to have a discharge They would have to build basically a sewage treatment plant for their lagoon, for their operation. And then they'd have a permit, and then we could see that. So it'll be very easy. Ask them for their NPDES permit and what the limits are in the permit. And if it looks like a municipal wastewater treatment plant permit, then fine, they're doing what everybody has to do with sewage.
Mhm.
But frankly, I'm telling you, the odds are, I mean, I'm not saying that some small operation isn't doing this, but there's no large operation doing that. So if they're telling you that, I think I got a bridge to sell you in Brooklyn.
And if I could get, I'm not sure, Nancy, if you mean that they're treating manure from CAFOs or that they're doing tertiary treatment for municipal wastewater treatment plants. Are you talking actually about manure?
I'm actually talking about the fish farm that's being planned and the treatment of the water that they're going to discharge. They claim it's going to be tertiary clean water. They're going to relatively clean water into the
got it.
ocean.
All right, I
Yeah.
don't know enough about the economics of fish farms.
Right.
It's possible that they do actually, I mean, there's nothing sacred about, there's nothing different about waste from animal feeding operations than there is from sewage. The sewage is actually probably nastier in the sense that it's got more metals in it, but although they put some nasty things in hog farms too, but you could build a sewage treatment plant or an exceptionally good sewage treatment plant, and for animal waste, it's just nobody does it given the economics of the business. But maybe if they're growing, solid goldfish or something, it would be worth it.
Well, I'll check on this. That's a given me angle to explore with
Yeah.
Well, yeah, ask them what their NPDES permit's going to look like.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I mean, there's one thin possibility how they could be doing this legitimately and not need a NPDES permit, and that's if they had a proper land treatment system. I'm not going to get off on that because this lecture is on the NPDES system rather than sewage treatment in general. But you can also have a good land treatment system. It's possible to build a proper septic system. It's just that large operations dealing in a lot of water generally can't do that because they don't want to acquire enough land. Okay. I don't know how I'm running in time. I am answering questions though, which I actually prefer to do rather than just rattle on. So please ask questions. And Gloria, if you or want to, read a question to me or something while I'm talking, that would be great.
All right, I'll watch.
Okay, so now the point is people are going to get permits to put discharges of containing pollutants. Obviously, if we just gave them a permit, it wouldn't do anything. So there's supposed to be limits in the permit. And the permit limits are going to have the way they work out these permits are that you're supposed to have the tighter of the technology-based limit and the water quality-based limit. And I've written up what I sort of meant to say here, but let me just say in general, the technology-based limit, it's like on your car. Everybody's got to have brakes on their car, whether they want to or not, and it's been decided that all cars in America shall have braking systems. I mean, I don't know whether the first car built had brakes. Maybe you just could throw your foot out or throw out an anchor, but we require all cars to have brakes in this country. So that's what we mean by a technology-based limit. Everybody has to have a technology-based limit or meet that limit. But then there are circumstances in which you need a water quality-based limit because just doing what we expect of everybody is not good enough. for meeting water quality standards. So for instance, I might be able to put the same level of ammonia or phosphorus in the Mississippi River, and the answer would be it's no big deal. There's so much dilution there that it's not a problem. But if I put that much ammonia in a creek, it would be a problem in every state other than Iowa where they like water pollution. But you've got to look at what you're doing in the various parts of, so you've got to look at the specific water quality based limits. And you're supposed to have the tighter of the two of them.
I'm gonna see you next week, Albert, so you better be careful.
I'm just telling the truth. I thought you'd be thankful for me explaining why people should never go to Iowa.
Albert,
So
we've already answered this in a previous class, but the question is, who sets the water quality standards?
yeah, I gave a whole course on water quality standards a few weeks ago. This guy has got the loudest rolling cart I've ever heard. I hope it's not bothering you as much as it's bothering me. The water quality standards, I basically they're set in order to look at what concentrations in the water will hurt things. And so essentially, for instance, aquatic life standards, they take tanks of waters containing various levels of pollutants and they drop totally non-consenting critters in them and they count how many die. And if 50% of them die within an hour or so, that's the LC50. And you use that and you divide it by 2. And that is your acute water quality standard. We don't think it's protective if what you're trying to protect, if half of it dies. So they thoughtfully divide it in 2. And that's the sort of system we've got. And that's one way that you work out the water quality standards. So for example, to use my example before, if I took a certain amount of ammonia and dumped it in the Mississippi River, it would be diluted so much that it wouldn't reach the level that would kill that fish. But if you put it in a smaller stream, you would not have that dilution.
Yeah, I think Debbie's answered my question because the state does have a role because doing part of my homework, I went to my state and looked for water quality standards. And but EPA has to approve the state standards. Is that correct?
Yes. I'm reluctant to get off too much on standards just because I did that a week or so ago, and some of the people have already heard too much on that. But basically, the states write standards, and US EPA approves them or disapproves them.
Yeah, that's the question I really wanted answered. Thanks.
Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Oh, okay. Now this is where it gets tricky, and Gloria is going to be challenged. Let's pop up the Lebanon permit. Can you do that?
Oh, look at me. Can you see it?
I don't.
Oh, is anybody looking?
Oh, I see it now. Oh, I'm sorry. I see it now.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to use Illinois permits because that was what was handy for me. And I'd like to be able to tell you that your state's permits will look just like this, but they won't. Every state has its own way of doing things wrong. And so, Kentucky writes 100-page permits. You'd think that'd be really protective, but about 98 pages of that 100 is all boilerplate. So here is what Illinois has. We're going to show you first the fact sheet, and that'll be important. If you follow permits, and I would urge you to do so in your state, you're going to be able to get a thing called a fact sheet, which is required by federal law that the states put out fact sheets, and they are to inform the public that a permit is being noticed. So let's run this through. Can you get to see all the excitement here? And this is a municipal permit. Just scroll through the fact sheet. I want to show you a few things when we get to the permit now, but scroll through the fact sheet. Gloria and I have practiced this for hours. That's why we're so smooth. Okay, so keep going. All right, now. Let's stop here. I know, yeah, get to where you see the limits with the chemicals on it. Yeah, all right. These are the limits. And you'll see CBOD, suspended solids, pH, fecal coliform, chlorine, residual ammonia, nitrogen, phosphorus, and total nitrogen. And I'm just going to stick on this page for a second, and we'll talk a little bit about what's going on here. This is a municipal permit, so it doesn't have a lot of fancy chemicals, or at least they don't think it does. It might, but they supposedly, what they're supposed to do is run a reasonable potential test in which they take samples of what they think is in the pollution, and then you're supposed to monitor that, and they're supposed to put limits for anything in which they think there's a reasonable potential that will violate water quality standards. Also, there are technology-based standards. Now, the technology-based standards for publicly owned treatment works, this is a sewage treatment work, are just for CBOD and TSS. So these limits, the 10 and 20 there, those are technology-based limits. I don't know where, suspended solids, 12 and 24. Every permit's going to say that. In Illinois, they've got slightly lower technology-based standards in some circumstances. There's a federal rule, but those are technology-based standards. It's like I told you, everybody's got to have brakes. So every discharger in Illinois is going to have those numbers at least of the 10 and 12 for CBOD and TSS. pH, they're not doing anything with. Fecal coliform, these guys have an exemption. That's another whole story. Fecal coliform is a problem, or E. coli. Those are pathogens. And if you have people swimming or children playing in the water, they're supposed to kill the bugs as they send them out the plant. But these guys have an exemption, meaning they've decided, the state of Illinois has decided that they're not going to require them to kill the bugs on the way out because nobody, they think, is being affected by this water. That's pretty much a big lie because they haven't looked, and the bugs stay alive well below the distance that they're looking, ever looking. It's worse in Iowa, though, I can tell you that. They've got
Okay,
exemptions.
okay, so this doesn't have recreation as a designated use.
Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean it's not flowing past the playground. That doesn't mean it's
Okay,
not.
wouldn't it have to have a designated use as recreation if they're going to have fecal coliform?
Well, it probably would, or it should. However, the fact of the matter is that all sorts of people might be getting in the water without knowing that recreation is not a designated use. I mean, so that is an issue. And in Illinois, they've got all sorts of disinfection exemptions. In Iowa, what they've done is not designated like 3/4 of the waters. It's the same in Missouri and a lot of states. They've said that they are not recreation waters, so they don't have to disinfect.
Why
Okay,
would they give an exception for something like E. coli or fecal coliform?
I'm sorry, what is the what?
Why would they give an exemption for that? It seems to me that's a public health hazard.
Well, it is a public health hazard, but it costs money to disinfect. So what do you care about, people or money? I mean, come on, this is America.
Well, are you talking about like irrigating agricultural lettuce fields where then in fact you have recalls because the lettuce is full of E. coli?
I'm not going to get off on the lettuce here. What I'm saying is that this is the discharge from a sewage treatment plant. It's full of pathogens, and they've decided the country has decided by not designating it for recreation, or in Illinois giving it a disinfection exemption, that they don't have to. However, for some reason, and I didn't even notice this before, they have a chlorine residual daily maximum, which makes no sense at all. I should ask them about it, because the reason you have a chlorine exemption or residual limit is the way they often disinfect is by using chlorine. And the problem with that is if you disinfect using chlorine and you don't take the chlorine out, then you kill all the fish because they can't take the chlorine. So we've got a limit. What you're supposed to do if you're using chlorine to disinfect is you disinfect and then you dechlorinate. I don't quite get this one, why they have a chlorine limit when they don't have a disinfection requirement. Maybe they disinfect voluntarily, or I don't know what's going on. Elaine Packard asked, do any municipal systems what?
Do any of them
Yes.
test for PFAS?
We'll get to that, interestingly enough. Let me finish my spiel here, and then let's get me to the next permit where I'll show you what Illinois' approach is to PFAS. So now this ammonia nitrogen, you see those limits? Those are all QBELs. What Illinois IEPA has done there, and they actually seem to have done it right, is they have taken the Illinois standard for ammonia, which is too weak, but at least they've taken the proper standard and they have worked out what the dilution factors are. And so those limits for March, October, November, those are all designed to keep ammonia from being so high that it'll kill the fish. Then you get phosphorus. You'll notice there's no limit, but they are requiring monitoring. This is a small permit. I don't want to get off on the phosphorus, but there's all sorts of regulations and not lack of regulations nationally about phosphorus, and the same with nitrogen. So here, Illinois has sort of has kind of gone part of the way. I see a question from Doris saying, can people eat the fish? That's a different issue. And that's one of the uses that you might protect against for if they thought for some reason that this town was putting out mercury or it's putting out PFAS or PCBs or something that would affect the fish, then there would be a limit for that. Or there should be a limit for that. There's not always a limit. Let's go through, scroll through the rest of this, and then maybe go to the next permit. Okay, these are DO limits. Let's finish with this permit. Just scroll through the rest of the permit, see if there's anything I've forgotten here. Now that I just worked off the fact sheet, but that's all right. Why don't you just, Gloria, you can forward this to everybody. That
Yeah.
was actually the fact sheet that you saw. Now this is the actual permit. You can, I'm sorry, Elaine, you can certainly we protect water for various things. That was last week's lecture too.
Mm.
You know, one of them is to protect the fish. One of them is to protect swimming and outdoor recreation. And part of that is protecting people who want to eat the fish. And that is another whole level of regulations and standards. The fish, frankly, they don't give a damn about the mercury. The mercury's not going to, the mercury is not in their system long enough to affect them. To kill a fish with mercury is very hard, but to kill a human being who eats a whole lot of fish that have mercury in it is unfortunately pretty easy. So I just went through the public notice on this one. Can you just scroll through it and show people the whole permit here?
Mm.
Because there's more fun here.
Wow.
So now we see the limits again. I gave you the limits were in the fact sheet. But now there's all this wonderful boilerplate as to special conditions, other things they're supposed to do.
Is this
And
highlighted for a reason?
what's that?
There's part of this is highlighted.
Yes. Oh, well, this is an interesting point here. It says the permitting sanitary sewer overflows are illegal. So what they've got here is they've got a separate system, but their sewage treatment plant isn't big enough to handle the sewage even when it's raining, not raining. So they're having overflows during, this isn't a combined sewer overflow. This is a sanitary sewer overflow. And apparently this town has sanitary overflows. Now the next sentence, they say overflows from sanitary sewers are expressly prohibited. So it's, they're sort of saying, well, you should work toward the situation in which you're not violating the law anymore.
All right.
So let's just whip through the rest of this and look at the other permit.
Albert, I have to say, I could not make a career doing this. I don't know how you can do this work. This
Here-
looks
You don't think it's fun? You don't
It
think it's fun?
like fun. No, it does not look like fun.
Well, I don't read every permit carefully and I look for certain things and I can whip through them pretty fast. I
Wow.
mean, all right, now let's look. This one is an industrial permit. It's in a suburb of Chicago. And I want to go through this one quickly too. So can you scroll on down here? And now you get to the yellow part here. And when you get there, stop. Somebody asked about PFAS. And nobody knows what to do about PFAS yet. There's only a few states that have water quality standards, but it has been brought to Illinois EPA's attention that PFAS is not a good thing in the water. So they are requiring monitoring and they're requiring guys to do the best you can and develop ways to do the best you can. So they don't have actual limits. Now, this again is just the notice. This is a fact sheet, the fact sheet front. Scroll on down to the permit, you'll see all the names again. You just go through the whole fact sheet, blah, 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 and these are where they're discharging. Now, stop here 1 second. It says problems here. After much screaming, we got them to list what the water was impaired for, which speeds up my day considerably because I can see, oh, you've already got these permit problems. So if you're discharging more mercury into a stream you've already said has too much mercury, that kind of is a bell for me and other problems. I should have done that on the other permit because on the other permit, they said there's too much phosphorus in the water, but they don't have a phosphorus limit. So I'll probably object to that one. This one I probably won't object to, but it's okay. So go through the rest of the permit. Got a pretty picture there. And we'll get through. All right, now we're at the actual permit. Keep going. Now we see limits again. Get down to the limits. Okay, here's the type. Now this guy's got a whole bunch of different discharge points doing different things. Some are just non-contact cooling water, which sounds harmless, but it's not. Then they got certain conditions on this non-contact cooling permit has very few limits on it because theoretically it's not coming into contact with anything. It's just going through the plant, it's just raining or they're using the water to cool something else, but it never comes into contact with all the nasties they're making. So in theory, that should be okay. But it is over 1 million gallons per day, and it's going to be hot water. So there's another problem with this permit. But let's go down further. Okay, go down and show everybody. Now you see, all right. You get more. This is a different discharge point. Now you've got some limits because they've got some processes here that looks like it's mainly organic. Total suspended solids, BOD 5, we've seen all that before. They don't seem to have ammonia. Let's go beyond that. Okay, next, now we got another discharge point.
Hmm.
See, these can get kind of complicated. Now you see here, this operation has stopped. This operation is in an industry which they've identified as potentially having PFAS. And so they do have this special conditions 17 and 18 that spell out what they're supposed to do to keep the PFAS out of the water. You'll also see me highlighting where it says temperature, sample frequency. I've got 1 a month, and I've highlighted that because it's ridiculous. I'm probably going to object to that because it's temperature. I mean, they're taking 1 reading a month. That doesn't tell you anything. That would, that's a ridiculously low sample. And furthermore, they get to decide when they take the samples. So if they know that they're putting out a whole lot of hot water, they're gonna just not take the sample then. Okay, so let's continue through the permit and see what else for fun we can find.
More PFAS.
More PFAS, I can keep going. Okay, all right. I didn't get you the best industrial permit that I could have gotten. Well, here's what's really good is they say you can't exceed this maximum by more than 1% of the hours in 12-month period. Well, they're not doing any hourly measurements at all. And they're only taking 12 monitorings. So they're gonna, if they get 1 hit over any of those numbers, obviously they'll be over 1%. So I don't know why I've corrected this for them half a dozen times, and I don't know why they haven't figured out that this once a month monitoring doesn't work with their temperature limits. And temperature doesn't sound very important. I know the water's hot, who cares? Well, the water being hot is a problem for at least 3 reasons. One is the fish can't take hot water. B, a lot of pollutants that are in the water become more toxic if they're warm. And then thirdly, the heat encourages harmful algal blooms. So heating up the water is not trivial. All right, keep scrolling, Gloria, and let's see if we can find anything else interesting here.
Oh, here's the PFAS.
All right, so here you've got the PFAS conditions. And your state probably is working on something like this. I think New York actually has PFAS water quality limits and probably has a PFAS standard and may actually have limits. But most states don't have standards and they're not putting limits in. They're putting things in like this, which basically says, look for it and see if you've got a problem. And if you do have a problem, then you'll have to address it. And in the meantime, do the best you can to keep PFAS out of your discharge. I think that's the end of what's interesting in that permit, but why don't you scroll the rest of it? Oh, wait a minute, I take it back. Oh, no, these are just different types of PFAS. They're having you look for everything. And they
Oh,
also put them in a minimum detection limit. Okay, what's that down there? Stormwater pollution plan. Saw some more yellow down here that, oh, this is something else. Stormwater, again, these factories, they not only have regular factory discharges, they also have stormwater. It rains on their parking lots and roofs too. So they have plans that are part of their NPDES permit as to how they're going to control the stormwater. which is different from the non-contact cooling water. The non-contact cooling water is water that's used, for cooling their equipment, but theoretically doesn't come into contact with whatever their industrial process is. All right. I think all this boilerplate does have deep meanings, but and actually a lot of it is important. And I have brought lawsuits based on the boilerplate. But I think we don't want to talk about that much more in a 1-hour show. So I think we're done looking at the permit,
All right.
and we can go. Does anybody have any questions? Now, you've seen all of that race past your eyes, so you now understand the permitting system, right?
Well, there are federal PFAS standards for drinking water. So where does that fit in? Isn't that one of like your technical kinds of water quality
Well,
standards?
there are new federal standards for drinking water. I don't know. Well, you may know more about that than I do, but this is a discharge permit. So the drinking water permit standards are not going to
Oh, it's
apply
not
to
a discharge. Okay, yeah, that's right. Thanks.
the drinking water standards apply to what comes out of your tap, not what comes out of your sewage treatment plant
Right.
or what needs to be in the river.
And it comes
Okay,
out of
so let's go on. I'm sorry, were there more questions?
No.
Okay, so now I know this has gone really fast. I'm just trying to give you some of the, an overview. I can tell you it's very technical and it's not, although I could teach you to look at these permits pretty quickly. It's not that hard, and you're not trying to review everything all the time. And there's all sorts of chemicals in these permits that I can't pronounce. And if IEPA is screwing up on those, there's just nothing going to happen about it. But some of these others, most of these other things, I mean, you can see whether or not there's a ammonia limit. You can see whether there's a phosphorus limit. You could see whether they put in anything to control PFAS. And these are all things that we can work out. And you can look at some of the things we've made them do in Illinois, like identify what the waters are impaired for in the permits. If it's the permit is going to allow more ammonia in the water and it's already impaired for ammonia, that's a warning sign. So let's look at these permits process. Basically, all of the permits are now written by state agencies. So it's not US EPA that writes the NPDES permits. It's Iowa DNR or Montana DEQ or, Ohio EPA. And they've all got processes in which they do what you just saw. They put out for public notice a draft of the permit. Some of the fact sheets are very good. There are fact sheet regulations as to what they notice they should give to the public about what's in the permit. The Illinois fact sheets are illegal. They don't contain a lot of the information that they should. The other fact sheets are worse. Some Indiana fact sheets are wonderful. So, every state's got its own way of doing things wrong.
Albert, well, what is the reason that Massachusetts, New Mexico, and New Hampshire can or won't?
Okay, well, the quick answer is I don't know. I mean, when they started out the program in 1972, and US EPA was writing all of the NPDES permits. However, Congress specifically wrote that they could, that states that US EPA was encouraged to delegate to the states. And most of the states have taken delegation. This is for two reasons. One, they get some federal money to run their NPDES permit program. Secondly, though, it gives them a state shield between the big bad federal government and their local polluters. So I don't know why Massachusetts has, and if there's somebody here from Massachusetts who can tell you, I'd heard Mexico was agitating for delegation, and they may have gotten it. This was as of 2021, so it's possible one of those three have now taken delegation.
We've got a big question here from Grant. Because the definition / scope for WOTUS was significantly narrowed under the U.S. Supreme Court Sakis decision, will this also significantly narrow and reduce the number of facilities required to file a NPDES permit?
Probably not in most states. The reason is that these are, well, if you got a sewage treatment plant and it's discharging all the time, by definition, it's now a perennial stream and it's going to be covered, but it's now a water of the United States. So most of the larger discharges will not need a permit. Where this will come in is in some of the dry states where you have creeks that don't flow anywhere. They might be very important to wildlife for a while, but I can imagine some people who have stormwater permits. A big area this has come in is with, say, oil and gas operations where they have pollution coming off of them, in some place in Utah that runs off into a stream that doesn't go anywhere. They might not need NPDES permits anymore. But my guess is that it will not affect, it won't affect NPDES permits, certainly in Illinois and other states that have water, because little streams, all of our little streams flow into big streams. And so if I put, it may change it might change where you enforce the standards. But if I have a discharge into Nowhere, unnamed tributary of Nowhere Creek that flows into Nowhere Creek, that still is only an ephemeral stream, Nowhere Creek is going to flow into, Sewage Creek, which is at least a intermittent stream and will probably still be a water of the United States. Okay, is that my last slide?
No.
Well, that's too bad. You guys are probably already sick of hearing me. So let's go to the last slide. Okay, well, we went through some of these. All right. Let's go back up. No, go permit objections. So I'm asking you, what are you looking for? So, for instance, the T-bell I told you about, there was a big dispute over, sometimes the states don't put in the proper technology-based effluent limit. The Q-bells are often calculated wrong, or often they ignore many of their standards. For example, they really don't like narratives. Water quality standards come in two forms. There are things that are numeric, that are things like, 0.1 milligram per liter, and that's relatively easy to work out. And then there are narratives that say things like, the waters of Iowa shall be free from unnatural algal growth. Okay, so the engineer looks at somebody who wants to put nitrogen or phosphorus in the water, and he doesn't have a numeric standard because, well, most states don't have numeric standards for phosphorus. And then he says, well, maybe the phosphorus there will create unnatural plant or algal growth. Maybe I should limit it for that. And he will have no idea how to do that because there hasn't established those numbers yet, and he's supposed to translate unnatural algal growth into a numeric limit in the permit. And if he's like the permit writers in most states, he's going to say no can do, and he's going to push the permit out without a phosphorus or a nitrogen limit. So then you got newer increased discharges. This is falls under anti-degradation. They're not supposed to have newer increased discharges unless they've proven it's necessary. And that can be very important. And that was a tool for getting away. We got a lot of limits for phosphorus in Illinois, just saying you want to put more phosphorus in, but you haven't proven it's necessary. And in fact, you can't prove it's necessary because there are processes that will get you down to at least 1 milligram per liter phosphorus that are really easy and everybody's doing them. And if you are going to put in more than that, it's not necessary. Another thing is monitoring. I pointed out a case like that. The monitoring for temperature in that one permit I showed you, it was nonsense. It was clearly inadequate. And they do that all the time. One thing I want to warn you, because the general public thinks that because a company has been violating its permit all the time, that it shouldn't get a new permit. And I can kind of see that, maybe you shouldn't give Al Capone another machine gun license. But they, by and large, the agencies take the position, well, that's an enforcement matter. It's too bad that Capone killed all those people, but our enforcement section does that. We're going to give him another machine gun permit. So I'm just warning you. Okay, let's go to what I hope is the ultimate slide. Enforcement. Again, it's very important. Where does the rubber meet the road? I've got okay. One thing is if you discharge without a permit, that's illegal. And if you do it intentionally, people do go to jail for that. The permits, and I ran through a lot of this boilerplate in the permits, but they generally require monitoring and filing a report, a monthly report, which we all DMRs. You can get them off of Echo, and I think Gloria even has the website for Echo that she's going to speak on, I think, after I finally finish. And so for every month, you should be able to look at Echo and see whether your local polluters have filed their discharge monitoring report and whether they are reporting violations. Now, the system is imperfect, and sometimes they don't, sometimes they don't get their reports in, or they get them in and the state doesn't get it on Echo for a long time, or the federal government doesn't get it in on Echo for a long time. But in theory, these discharge monitoring reports are supposed to show whether or not they are violating their permits. Now you may ask, isn't it pretty weird that we're asking the polluter to report and trusting them to report whether or not they violated? And I would tend to agree with you. And I'm certain that a lot of violations go unreported. The only comfort I can give you, though, is if they really severely violate their permits, there are things like dead fish that will testify against them, and they get caught. And if it turns out they didn't report, then they go to jail. Whereas if they report that they put out too much ammonia last month, yeah, they might get a slap on the wrist. If they don't report that they put out too much ammonia last month, and there's a fish kill, and it turns out that they intentionally failed to file their reports, well, then some people can have their lives ruined. So I think by and large, people file their DMRs honestly if they file them at all. Now I got a coal company in Southern Illinois that avoids having violations found by just not filing their reports. And so they don't file false reports. They file no reports at all. And those, eventually the state gets around to saying, hey, you haven't filed any reports for 3 years. You want to do that? Or we can look up and say that they didn't file them. I'm getting a lot of noise in the background now, so I'm hoping I'm about done, but I'm willing to try and answer some questions if there are any left.
What's the agency that you go to find out if these permits have been violated? For example, would you go to Public Works in your city? Would you go to County Public Works? To any of the municipal things to see where it would be filed, that it would show that, say, your water district or your sewage district had a bad
I've got good
discharge?
news. I have a good news on this, which is that if the system is working properly, it should be on ECHO, which is a US EPA website that allows you to check on permits. And Gloria, I thought you were going to actually talk about that a little.
No, that was their homework assignment, though. We all went on Echo and and then
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
somebody didn't do their homework assignment.
I went there. It was really interesting. I could get right into my zip code to see what was going on. It turned out that it was a dry cleaner, and he's been dead for probably 20 years. But his facility, which is no longer there, is still listed as it's violating of the permit. So I don't know. I mean,
Well, they might
up to date it
they,
was.
they, they might not be filing reports, and but that's. I'm not saying the system's perfect. What I used to have to do is we would go down to Springfield or some other state. I've only really done it in Illinois, I think. They would bring out paper files of all their written DMRs that were sent to Springfield, and we would have to go through them and see whether there were violations. And I spent many happy days in Springfield just going through discharge monitoring reports. Then they started putting them on computer in Springfield. And now I'm told that they're all reported to the federal government, so they should be on ECHO.
very good. Any other questions? Oh, Grant's got one typed here. You talk about animal waste spraying on farm fields. If a human source sewage treatment plant used a spray over farm field discharge approach, would they still need to file for a NPDES permit? And Grant's
Okay, well,
I know what he's talking about here.
no, they wouldn't, but it wouldn't probably be done. But if they did it, I actually don't. There are good land treatment systems, believe it or not. If you use enough land and you spray the waste so that it's not in such a huge amount that it's going to wash off, that is a legitimate form of wastewater treatment. And it is done in a few places that way. The place that was most famous was Muskegon, Michigan. What they would have is a series of lagoons. So they took the sewage out of Muskegon, they would put it in a lagoon, and that would, basically it rots in the lagoon and takes a lot of the nasties out that way. And then they would put it in a series lagoon, and then they would ultimately spray the water on a field. And that was how actually Congress thought they were going to eliminate discharges to some extent, to a large extent, is that they would eventually, Congress, when it passed the Clean Water Act, didn't think that people would quit flushing their toilets in 1985. They thought that that municipalities would develop land treatment systems and other systems so that they never had to discharge anything but pure water.
We have it's like a mobile home park, and they have, it looks like 3 lagoons, and you can see like they're aerating 1 or 2 of them. And then the final product is sprayed in this big circle on a farm field right next to well, very close to a stream, I would add. And we're
Well,
wondering, it doesn't sound very good.
well, I'm not saying you can't build a bad land treatment system. All of these CAFOs are bad land treatment systems. So yes, you can build a bad land treatment system. And I'm not saying anything about the one that's close to you. I'm just saying, what does a sewage treatment plant do? It's not, you read I, of course, one of the great philosophers of the 20th century was, of course, Dr. Seuss. And he wrote The Lorax, which is everybody's favorite environmental book, except that but actually my favorite is Cat in the Hat, because what he does in the Cat in the Hat is we've got mother's new dress that they wipe off the bathtub with, right? And then there's a series of dilution. He has all these cats spread it out. And eventually, though, you've got the last cat, which is the baboon. However, there is no baboon. That's the thing to learn about the whole process. There is no baboon. So what we basically are doing is using natural processes to break it down. And in a sewage treatment plant, you use energy to break it down quicker. With a land treatment system, you're using land or some other resource to break it down. And hopefully, like with a septic system, it's going to settle down through the land. And, the earthworms will eat the crud. Now, if you got fancy toxic metals or PFAS, it's not going to work. But that's the problem with, with a lot of our sewage treatment, is that we've got stuff in there that the sewage treatment plants aren't designed to take out.
And Grant further comments that you can't find a NPDES, but it makes sense because it's in the land, so now it's non-point.
I'm sorry. He can't find a NPDES for what?
For this land sewage treatment outfit.
They don't require if it's a true land treatment system and they don't have a discharge, then they're in the same situation as the CAFOs. No discharge, no discharge permit. You only have to get a permit if you are discharging water with pollutants in it. And so in theory, it's possible they don't need a discharge permit. It's 8 o'clock now and I got a mob